It is October 1777. The British have the most powerful army on earth. America is broke, freezing, and losing. One more defeat, and the revolution dies forever. But deep in the forests of New York, something is about to happen. Something nobody saw coming. Something that would change the entire world. If you have ever wondered how America actually won its freedom, not the textbook version, but the real, bloody, desperate version, then stay right here. Because this is the story they never taught you properly in school. And trust me, by the end of this video, you will look at American history in a completely different way. Make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. Now, let us go back to a time when the United States of America almost never existed at all. By the summer of 1777, the American Revolution was in serious trouble. General George Washington had already lost New York City to the British. The American capital, Philadelphia, was about to fall. The Continental Army, the fighting force of the Revolution, was a ragged collection of farmers, tradesmen, and volunteers. They were underpaid, often unpaid entirely. They were poorly clothed, poorly armed, and badly outnumbered. On the other side stood the British Army, one of the most professionally trained and well-funded military forces the world had ever seen. The contrast could not have been more stark. This was not a fair fight, not even close. And yet, these desperate American soldiers kept fighting because they believed in something. They believed that ordinary people had the right to govern themselves. That was the idea. That was what this whole bloody war was about. But ideas alone do not stop musket balls. And in 1777, the British had a plan, a very good one, that threatened to end the revolution once and for all. The man behind that plan was General John Burgoyne. His nickname was Gentleman Johnny, and it suited him perfectly. Burgoyne was charming, theatrical, and absolutely convinced of his own brilliance. He liked fine wine, fine clothes, and the company of aristocrats. He also believed, with complete confidence, that this colonial rebellion was nothing more than a temporary embarrassment for the British Empire. He intended to crush it quickly and go home a hero. Burgoyne's strategy was elegant in its simplicity. The plan was to split the American colonies in two. His army would march south from Canada through the forests and lakes of upstate New York and seize control of the Hudson River Valley. A second British force would push east from Lake Ontario to meet him, and General William Howe would march north from New York City. All three armies would converge on Albany, New York. Once they held the Hudson River Valley, New England, the beating heart of the Revolution, would be completely cut off from the southern colonies. The rebellion would be strangled from the inside. Game over. On paper, it was brilliant. Burgoyne was so confident it would work that he reportedly made a £50 bet with a colleague that he would be in Albany before Christmas. He was not a man who expected to lose, but the plan had a fatal flaw that Burgoyne did not yet know about. General Howe, instead of marching north to Albany as planned, decided to move his army south toward Philadelphia. No one is entirely sure why. Perhaps he misread his orders. Perhaps he believed capturing the American capital was more important. Whatever the reason, the three-pronged plan that was supposed to end the revolution was already falling apart before Burgoyne had fired a single shot. In June of 1777, Burgoyne set out from Canada with nearly 8,000 soldiers, British regulars, German mercenary troops called Hessians, loyalist volunteers, and hundreds of camp followers. He also brought with him an enormous train of artillery and supply wagons. It was a powerful force, but the terrain of upstate New York was about to become his worst enemy.
The forests were dense and dark. The paths were narrow and muddy. The summer heat was brutal, and the Americans under General Philip Schuyler were doing everything in their power to slow Burgoyne down. They cut down trees across roads. They destroyed bridges. They contaminated water sources. Every mile south cost Burgoyne time, men, and supplies that he could not easily replace. His supply lines, stretching all the way back to Canada, were dangerously thin. His army was moving slower and slower through country that seemed almost designed to swallow them whole. Then came a disaster that Burgoyne badly could not afford. In August 1777, he sent a large foraging party into Vermont to search for horses, food, and supplies. Near the town of Bennington, that foraging party ran straight into a force of American militia commanded by General John Stark. What followed was a rout. Nearly 1,000 British and Hessian soldiers were killed or captured in a single afternoon. Burgoyne received the news with quiet dread. He had lost men he simply could not replace, and his supplies were running critically low. Meanwhile, the American command had changed. General Philip Schuyler, who had done excellent work slowing the British advance, was replaced by General Horatio Gates. Gates was a cautious, politically savvy commander. He was not a man who liked to gamble on the battlefield. His instinct was to find strong ground, build solid fortifications, and make the British come to him. And so he turned to a Polish military engineer named Thaddeus Kosciuszko to choose the right place to make a stand. Kosciuszko found it, a high ridge above the Hudson River called Bemis Heights. Fortified properly, it would force Burgoyne to fight his way through or be stopped completely. But the most important figure in what was about to happen was not Gates. It was a man named Benedict Arnold. Before his infamous betrayal, Arnold was arguably the finest and most aggressive battlefield commander the Americans had. His soldiers adored him. He was reckless, instinctive, and ferociously brave. The kind of leader who did not just give orders from behind the lines, but rode directly into the chaos of battle himself. Arnold and Gates were temperamental opposites, and they hated each other. But for now, they were on the same side. On the morning of September 19th, 1777, Burgoyne decided he could wait no longer. He could not stay still. His army was already beginning to starve. He split his force into 3 columns and moved forward to break through the American lines. It was a risky move. In the dense forest, visibility was nearly zero. Communications were impossible. 3 separate columns of soldiers trying to coordinate in thick woodland without being able to see each other. It was a formula for confusion. The fighting centered on a clearing called Freeman's Farm. It lasted all afternoon. The 2 sides clashed, retreated, charged again, and clashed once more. The noise of musket fire, artillery, and screaming men echoed through the trees for hours. When darkness finally fell, the British technically held the field. But the cost had been appalling. Nearly 600 British soldiers killed or wounded in a single day. For an army that was already running short of men and supplies, that was a wound that would not heal easily. Benedict Arnold had been in the thick of the fighting all day, rallying American troops at the moments when the British push was at its hardest. Historians later argued that without Arnold's aggressive interventions at Freeman's Farm, the British might well have broken through entirely. But when Arnold returned from the battle and argued passionately with Gates that they needed to press their advantage immediately, Gates refused. He ordered the army to hold their fortified position. Arnold was furious. Their confrontation exploded into a full-blown command crisis. Gates eventually stripped Arnold of his command. Arnold stayed in camp fuming, technically forbidden from having anything to do with the next battle. For 3 weeks after Freeman's Farm, both armies waited. Burgoyne was desperately hoping for relief from General Clinton, who had begun a limited advance up the Hudson from New York City. It was too little. Clinton turned back well short of Albany. No relief was coming. Meanwhile, the American forces at Bemis Heights were growing by the day. Militia were flooding in from across New England. Ordinary men who had heard about the battle and picked up their rifles and come to fight. Gates now commanded more than 11,000 soldiers. Burgoyne had fewer than 6,000, and they were hungry, exhausted, and cold. On October 7th, 1777, Burgoyne made his final gamble. He sent 1,500 men forward to probe the American lines, partly reconnaissance, partly a desperate attempt to find a weak point. The Americans were ready. Gates sent his own troops out to meet them. The British lines began to buckle almost immediately under the pressure, and then Benedict Arnold appeared on the battlefield. Despite having no command, despite Gates having officially removed him from authority, Arnold could not stay out of the fight. He rode out onto the battlefield on his own horse, without any orders, in a state of furious, magnificent defiance. What followed is one of the most extraordinary individual acts of the entire Revolutionary War. Arnold rode across the open field under fire, rallying troops, leading charge after charge, seemingly oblivious to the bullets flying around him. Soldiers followed him almost instinctively, because that is what happened when Arnold led. Men simply followed. He led the assault that shattered the Bremen Redoubt, a critical German defensive position that anchored the right flank of Burgoyne's line. When that position collapsed, the entire British right flank collapsed with it. At the very moment of that decisive breakthrough, Arnold's horse was shot dead beneath him, and he was struck in the same leg that had been wounded at the siege of Quebec 2 years earlier. He went down hard, but the damage was done. The British line had broken. The battle was over. Burgoyne ordered an immediate retreat north, but it was already too late. American forces had moved to cut off every road back to Canada. His army, exhausted and starving, was completely surrounded. He had no food, he had no reinforcements, he had no escape. On October 17, 1777, General John Burgoyne formally surrendered his entire army to General Horatio Gates. Nearly 5,800 British and Hessian soldiers laid down their arms. It was the largest British military surrender in more than a century. But the true importance of what had just happened went far beyond a single battle in an upstate New York forest. The news traveled quickly across the Atlantic to Europe, and in Paris, an American diplomat named Benjamin Franklin had been waiting for exactly this moment. France and Britain had been enemies for generations. France had watched the American Revolution with enormous interest, not out of any deep love for democracy, but because a weakened Britain was a weakened rival. The French government had been secretly supplying the Americans with some money and weapons, but they would not commit to an open military alliance with a cause that looked like it was losing. They needed proof that America could actually win. Saratoga was that proof. On February 6, 1778, France signed a formal military alliance with the United States of America. French money, troops, warships, and supplies began flowing across the Atlantic in quantities that the Americans could never have generated on their own. Spain and the Netherlands followed. Suddenly, Britain was not fighting a colonial rebellion. It was fighting a world war on multiple continents and across multiple oceans. The entire strategic picture of the conflict had changed overnight, and it had changed because of what happened in the forests of upstate New York in the autumn of 1777. History, as always, had its bitter ironies. The man who did more than any other individual to win the Battle of Saratoga, Benedict Arnold, would become 2 years later the most infamous traitor in American history. He defected to the British in 1780 and his name became a synonym for betrayal. The monument that stands today at Saratoga National Historical Park to honor the hero of that battle does not show Arnold's face or mention his name. It shows only a boot representing the leg he shattered in his greatest moment. General Burgoyne returned to England in disgrace, was criticized by Parliament, but largely escaped serious personal punishment. He later reinvented himself as a playwright. General Gates received enormous public credit for the victory, credit that Arnold's courage had largely earned for him. The Battle of Saratoga is recognized by historians as the single most important turning point of the American Revolutionary War. A clash in a forest clearing, fought by desperate men on one side and a starving, abandoned army on the other, echoed across Europe, reshuffled the alliances of world powers, and ultimately determined the fate of a nation. If Burgoyne had won, if his grand strategy had succeeded, if Howe had marched north as planned, if Arnold had stayed in his tent, the revolution might well have ended in 1777. America as we know it might never have been born. Every democracy that was later inspired by the American example, every freedom that traces its roots back to that revolutionary idea, every ripple effect across 250 years of world history, all of it, in some way, connects back to those few desperate weeks in the forests of New York. And that is the real story of Saratoga. Not just a battle, but the moment a revolution refused to die. If this made you see history differently, hit that like button and subscribe, because we go on every story we tell.